I wanted to start off with a story. When I was back in college, one of my roommates was, I walked home after a class, and she pulled me aside and said, Becca, I need your help. I need you to pray for me. I go, sure, absolutely. We're at a Bible college. It's, of course. I said, well, a friend of mine recently came to me and came out as transsexual. And I'm the first person that he's felt comfortable enough to share this with. So can you just be praying for me as I'm walking him through, as I'm counseling him, and just figuring out how to be a loving Christian to him, although him to be her. Here's the thing. These kind of conversations we would expect in a cafe, in a maybe a shopping center, somewhere you see in person, whereas this conversation happened in the middle of an online game. With the change of culture, we're seeing online communities are becoming more and more prevalent. Everything from Facebook to Twitter to Reddit, TikTok, all these other social media platforms, as well as online gaming, online dating sites, you name it. There's all of a sudden, there's this whole burst in different platforms offering community and using online platforms. Now, anytime there's something new, there are criticism, there are critiques, there are worries that come with it. Some common ones include, well, people pretend to be someone else online. They never really show who they are. Or, well, people bond when they're actually doing something together, not through just staring at a screen the whole time. Or how about this one? Online friendships will always be inferior to in-person relationships. Something's missing. Or only social outcasts use online communities for networking. There's this picture of someone who is unable to make it in the in-person world when it comes to relationships, so they go online. Or lastly, online friendships cannot support you when you need it most. I'm sure we've all heard these comments at some point or in some fashion. One of the things we're going to be talking about is, what do we do with these online communities? They're everywhere. But can they actually lead to genuine community? Can these relationships that are created online really lead to true community? One of the ways we're going to look at that is through a case study, and just kind of examine one specific online community and see how that works. Lastly, we're going to look at what is the impact of this conversation. What does online community relationships and just their presence in the world mean for ministry and missions as a whole? The particular case study we're going to be focusing on is called an MMORPG, which for some that sounds like alphabet soup. It stands for massively multiplayer online role-playing game. In essence, think of millions of people gathering in an online world. Usually it's a fantasy or sci-fi setting. People create their own character. It's literally designed for role playing. So you've got this fantasy world, you create your own character. Sometimes it's an elf, sometimes it's a minotaur, sometimes it's a goblin. I mean, you name it. Sometimes it's like cat, human, creature, whatever you can think of, there is one. And lastly, you take these characters and go on quests throughout this world. Again, they're fantasy world, so it could look like slaying a dragon. It could like finding buried treasure, you name it. The other thing to keep in mind with this particular platform is many users have not met in real life. So because they're generally international platforms, they're generally, again, millions of people in one space all at the same time and doing their own thing. So there's many people who never have and never will meet face to face. So in some ways, all of these categories make it an ideal setting to analyze when it comes to the actual possibility of real community and online, because if you notice, these things mirror so much of those criticisms. Now, how popular are MMORPGs? A lot of times we think of these online games, when we picture them, we picture this niche group. Again, usually the awkward, usually those who can't make it in society. There's this niche group, small outcasts who play these things. But the reality is these are massive. World of Warcraft, which you can see on the screen, it is the largest of all of the MMORPGs. You're looking at 113.9 million players total. Now, granted, this is all accounts, but this is massive. I mean, this is about a third of the US in population. Now, granted, not all these players are on every single day. However, the average login for any day in the month of February, so the average logins in February was 5.41 million in any given day. This is around the size of Costa Rica, wandering around in this online setting. And granted, this thing these are not short-lived either. This is one of the longest running ones. It started in 2004 and it's still actively operating. And lastly, like I said, it's an international platform. It's not just American, it's not just Western. You have sections of this that literally span across the globe here. Again, there's a lot of prejudice as far as who plays these games, but the reality is there's some massive studies done by a guy named Nick Yee. Nick Yee did about 10 to 15 years of research with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. He found that 50% of these players who responded work full time. This is not just a whole bunch of guys living in their mother's basements. 36% are married and 22% have children. They have real lives. There's quote unquote normal people who play these games. Average age is 30, which a lot of people think this is something that goes on with teenagers, but it's adults too. Average gender is male. That does fit the stereotype, I'm afraid. And then lastly, it's largely unreligious. There's studies that have measured the comparison between someone's activity in these games and their participation combined with their religious involvement. And a lot of these people are unreligious. Why do people play? Again, Nick Yee in some of his research has really narrowed it down to 3 different goals. One is achievement. It's like, I am not doing well in my in-person business. I need to feel like I'm getting something done in a day. I need to feel like I can actually meet my goals. Another one, social interaction. People go on to make new friends or do something with friends in real life, do something with a spouse. There's cases where families play together. And lastly, immersion. It's like, I just want to experience a good story. I want to take part in a good story. So these are kind of the 3 broad categories. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on that second one, social interaction, for this particular presentation and conversation. Again, in this same study with Yee, this thing is massive. 41% of online gamers feel that their in-game relationships, again, with people they've never met besides online games, were either comparable or better than those with their real-life friends. Let me make that shorter and summarize. 41% of gamers believe that their online gaming relationships were either just as good as or better than their in-person friendships. That is staggering. That is almost half. This is not a small, or these are not flippant relationships. Here's another one to think about. 24%, or almost a quarter, of people shared either issues or secrets or heartfelt problems with online friends that they felt they couldn't share with offline friends. So 1 in 4 people have shared something with an online friend that they don't feel comfortable sharing with offline friends. And in my story earlier, that was his case. And these are staggering, staggering numbers. This is not a small portion of people who feel that, yeah, you know, I may not be able to make friends in real life. Like this is a big number, and these numbers should make us think. As far as how community is generated in MMORPGs, there is a structure within the game called a guild. Think of it as a community organization. It's a formal organization. They've got their own community covenants of sorts. They have their own history. They have their own culture within their games. They have their own lingo and their way of talking about games, their way of talking about their adventures. Usually there's mentoring systems within these organizations, but they're literally designed for community. Like it's within these games, you have different sorts of quests. There's some quests that are smaller, that it's like, okay, go find the buried treasure, and usually you grab your shovel and you go find it. But within these games, you also have these larger scale quests. Some of them are called dungeons, some of them are called raids. When you're dungeon level, you're looking at about 5 people. And again, the game is built, so you need 5 people to do it. On your bigger scale, you have these raids, which requires about 30. So again, the game itself, in order for people to actually do what the game requires them to do, you need to have these groups that you're regulars with. You need to have groups that you know well enough and can play with well enough, that you've had experiences with well enough that you can actually accomplish things together. Within these guilds, this is often a touch point for those team building type quests. So like, for example, if I needed to go with a group of 5 people, I might start by looking at my guild, people I already know. So that's kind of the role that it plays. Again, within these guilds, there's roles and responsibilities. They have banks. They've got all these structures in place to create these groups, and they have roles and responsibilities. You have a president, you've got a vice president, you've got officers. You have some people who go out and grab resources to help their community. You have some people who build things to help their community. It feels like a small town, but it's this alliance within these games. And also, studies have shown that these guilds are what actually keep people playing. So even for those who have the motivations for achievement or immersion, where they either want to feel they've done something or they feel like they want to be involved in the story, in both cases, these guilds are what actually keep people going in the games. Like what actually leads to people to spend on average 20 hours a week, again, half a work week in these games, is these guild structures. These alliances and these friendships are what actually draw people in and keep them in. Now, in this particular setting, my friend, my roommate, and her friend from online, this really was her story. She was one who went in and as a believer just saw her role in this game and was able to make these connections. But she's not alone in this. And with all of these questions, we really need to ask ourselves if these online communities are actually able to spawn real relationships, where we see almost half of people consider these relationships as just as high quality as their in-person ones. And if these communities drive 1 in 4 people to share their heartfelt secrets, then it should lead us to ask, how can we use these for kingdom ministry? Whether it's MMORPGs, whether it's social media, whether it's another setting of those sorts, how can we use these online communities which have real relationships for kingdom ministry? First of all, I want to take a look at what's already being done. There's 3 organizations in particular who have seen this need and have responded to it. First one, there's a group called God Squad Church. This is a gamer-focused online church. Now, for some of us, that just hearing that idea just initially makes us cringe. Like, church is in person. It's got a steeple. It's in a building. Like, what do we do with this? But the reality is there's 1,800 members. There's 1,800 gamers who come together every Saturday night and log into this viewer channel where it's a common gamer channel where people will stream and show videos of what they're doing in games. And this pastor, who's on one hand this intense gamer and loves gaming, loves these MMORPGs, but on the other hand loves Jesus. And they have found in this ministry, they've had real conversion, they've had real relationships, real counseling sessions. And what gets really interesting is that this particular church, one of their ministry focuses is internet trolls. We're looking at people who on purpose try to disrupt things. They've had cases where people have gone into their chat rooms and tried to wreck them, and they have loved them and cared for them and talked with them in such a way that they've actually come to Christ and joined the church. Again, it makes us question our paradigm, but at the same time, it is generating, like, it is doing work for the kingdom, and it ought to make us think. Another one is independent gamer missionaries. Cases like my friend, where it's Christians who see themselves as ministry in the marketplace, for lack of a better word, even if it is that marketplace in the middle of a fantasy world, where these individuals go in and see themselves as representatives for the gospel in the midst of these games. So in addition to their role playing and slaying of dragons, they're sharing Christ, and they're counseling, I mean, informally, but counseling. That's another level where you'll see a number of these. The third one, which has been a fun discovery for me, actually, is called a group called Love Thy Nerd. They're a social media based ministry. Their goal is written here on the screen. We exist to be the love of Jesus to nerds and nerd culture. They touch on people who are big fans of, like, whether it's Lord of the Rings, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Disney, whether it's these games and that world, whether it's online board games, different TV shows, I mean, you name it. They just love being able to minister to this particular group of people. And when we look at what they're doing, again, a lot of their platform is social media based, but the goal is to show love to these particular groups of people. One of these subsection groups is these MMORPG players. And so they have on their website, they have blog posts and such that talks about either the newest games, or what does it mean to love Jesus in these games, or what do you do with some of the maybe less than wholesome content in some of these games as a Christian. So it's, again, another organization that just sees their role in using these online platforms for the sake of the gospel. So just to wrap up, there's a couple key things we've talked about. First of all, we know that online communities have an increasing importance in society. You can't ignore them. Between Facebook and Twitter and all the rest, you just can't ignore the fact that online communities exist and they're growing. Second, based on what we've seen in MMORPGs, genuine relationships can take place on these platforms. We've seen in these MMORPGs that even though a lot of these people will never meet face to face, they can still have enough trust, they can still have enough experiences together, they can still have enough history together that there's real trust built and real relationships happening. Sometimes even better than those that are taking place in person. Lastly, we see the church needs to consider seriously how to use these online communities for kingdom ministry. We can't ignore them. We may not always know what to do with them, but they're there and we can't ignore the possibilities. So just some contemplations to think through as individuals, and I'd love to think through these together just in our question and answer session as well. Number one, how can the church utilize these communities for ministry? We've seen a couple examples, but how else can we use them? Second, what skills are necessary to reach online communities effectively? It's a completely new paradigm of ministry, and therefore the skills of discipleship in these settings may look very different than they would in, say, a college ministry where you're on campus. Third, what training do ministry leaders need to effectively minister using these online platforms? So if these skills are necessary, then how does that affect our training and our seminary programs? Then lastly, we do know that there is a value in in-person relationships as well. So how do we use these ministries as bridge ministries? How do we use these to plug people into a local church? Another thing I didn't mention earlier, like a lot of these relationships online are healthy because individuals are healthy in their real life worlds. One issue that comes up in these conversations is video game addiction. And those numbers are less, or like it is less likely when people have whole and healthy relationships in the real person world or in-person world. Julie Shoemaker will be doing a session on that later, and I see how these two tie together in that front as well, which is fun. But we need to consider, how do we get people from these online platforms and on these online communities into their real in-person church as well?